Okay, so tonight we're going to talk more about truth and knowledge, as we'll be getting into some things that I have studied quite deeply in the past. Some of you may know that I spent 4 or 5 years doing a PhD study in epistemology, and along the way I ran across a guy named Michael Polanyi, who happens not to be a Christian. But in reading his work, he really transformed my ideas of how we come to know things. And if any of you want to read him, he's this book here, the Study of Man. Interesting story. We were coming back from a camping trip as a family through Sparta, North Carolina. I noticed a used bookstore, and we'd been listening to a Mars Hill tape. I don't know if y'all know what that is, but what's the guy's name that does that? You remember? Ken Myers. Yeah, Ken Myers audio recordings, where he interviews people who have written books recently, and he had interviewed someone who'd written a book on Polanyi, and the name had come up, and we went in this used bookstore, and my wife found this book on the free shelf. And picked it up just based on name recognition. And this was over the summer, and I put it on my desk under some things, and meaning to get to it, it probably sat there for 6 to 8 weeks. And my semester was coming up for my PhD studies, and it was a couple of days, and I went into my office and said, what can I sit down with? I don't have much time. And I saw this, and you can see its size, and started looking through it. I was up till I think about 3 a.m. that morning, writing outlines for a PhD dissertation based on what I was reading and so forth. It was really transforming in that way. But probably the best outline of this thought actually comes in another book called The Tacit Dimension. Subsequently, I engaged some Christians who have actually taken his work and applied them to Christian thought, which he knew that was a possibility when he was writing. He would put actually paragraphs at the end of this book that you theologians, you should really pay attention, because there's something here. And so one of the guys is Alexander Thompson, who wrote on tradition and authority. That's our topic for the second lecture this evening. And Leslie Newbegin, who wrote a very good book on the gospel in a pluralistic society. We'll get into his thinking a little bit in the first session, but more in the second session. What we're going to do first is sort of talk about history. Is how has kind of the thought of how people know, what has been people's perspective of knowledge over time. And some of you probably made it through the reading on Ramsey, and Ramsey's perspective, his timeline, I've adapted some of it because it's so close to my own. I only read Ramsey probably about 1.5 years ago, but immediately recognized how closely we were in thinking. So anyway, we're going to look at that and look at some trends that tend to play out as the philosophers start talking to each other and express how we come to know. In Ramsey, he mentions a line of what? Anybody remember?
Despair.
He calls it despair or some, and that actually comes from Schaeffer as well. And
the line of
he is there, and he is not solid. The line of despair. He also calls it the line of uncertainty. So it's this point at which a culture decides that they're really in a deep mess, right? And they really don't know anything at all. And I think the word that Schaeffer uses and Ramsey adopts is despair is very apropos. There's another writer that I've studied quite a bit, Soren Kierkegaard, who also writes on how people come to know, and he calls despair the sickness unto death. You might know where that phrase comes from. You heard that phrase before, the sickness unto death?
Lazarus.
Yeah, and I'm gonna come back to that in just a minute. But about Jesus, when he's informed about Lazarus's condition, and he's talking to his disciples, he says, "This sickness is not unto death." And so Kierkegaard picks up on that, and he writes a book called "The Sickness Unto Death," and he talks about despair being basically a life outside of Christ, a life outside of hope. And essentially, it's a life that's rooted in sin and focus on self. And he talks about different types of despair. And one type he talks about is that one is unconscious even of being in despair. Y'all know anybody that's just living their life out? They're not even thinking about the more important things of life. They're just going from day to day, and perhaps filling their time with adventure, perhaps filling their time with entertainment. Our society is very good at creating ways to fill up your life, and in many ways, filling it up to a standpoint that one isn't even thinking about life. And so that's sort of, but Kierkegaard says that even this person may not understand they're in despair, but make no mistake, they are. And then the other type is a despair in which one is conscious of being in despair. Sometimes this takes a form of weakness, where perhaps they don't know the gospel, or perhaps they just love self more than the God, but it's weakness in a sense that they're not seeking God for the answer. They understand their despair and they're just living in it. But then there's also a type of despair which I see increasingly in our society. That's a defiance, right? It's a despair that's in defiance of the truth, and a rebellion, an open rebellion against God. I think our culture is increasingly of that type. Kierkegaard says that the one that is in despair is spiraling out of control and increasingly out of contact with truth and life. And then he talks about the solution, which I'll get to in a minute. But first, I want to talk briefly about Lazarus. You remember the story is that Jesus is out and he's traveling about, and messengers come and tell him that Lazarus is very sick, and to come. Well, Jesus doesn't come right away. He decides to wait to a couple of days, 3 days, and then makes a statement that the sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it. And those of you who know the story, I think most of you do, know where all of that is leading. But a point that he's making is that, there's two deaths. There's a physical death and a spiritual death. And this sickness that Lazarus had was a sickness of a type that led to a type of death. The death that Jesus was talking about was the spiritual death. This sickness is not unto death. And then he makes another curious statement along the way. It kind of pops out of the context. He tells his disciples, well, they're concerned about his safety. His safety has been threatened, and now he's going back to the area where he's been threatened, and they're saying, are you sure you want to go? And he says, are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if one walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him. So, I think one application is a subtle application here. The obvious application is that he's going to be okay. The subtle application that Jesus is the light, and he's not concerned about his purposes being accomplished. If one walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. If we walk in the light of Christ, we know from 2 Peter chapter 1 that we will never ever stumble at any time. But if one walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. And of course, he gets there and he has the conversations with Mary and Martha, and he comforts them, and then he makes this statement. He says, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die." Do you believe this? And of course, that's the answer. Ultimately, that's the answer to the question of despair. Is it's replaced by hope and the promise that Jesus is the resurrection and the life. He's about to perform a miracle. He's going to raise Lazarus from the dead. Death has no power over Christ, over the work of Christ. Lazarus is going to be raised, foreshadowing what's going to happen. Jesus is going to predict that he's going to be killed and he's going to raise again. And then that's going to happen. And that resurrection is a foreshadowing of the resurrection of each one of us. And we will be raised as well. Kierkegaard, his answer for despair, it's strangely worded. I'll get to the meat of it. He says the answer for despair is when the self is grounded transparently in the power of God who created it. So when we cease to live in rebellion against God, when we recognize who brought us into being and who holds the world together, even us, and rest ourselves in him, and he works through us toward good works and toward salvation. That's the answer for despair. Kierkegaard says it very philosophically and cryptically, but that's essentially what he's getting at.
I was thinking about how Schaeffer would respond to a person who's not even conscious of their despair, right?
Yeah.
Because you can't just all of a sudden say, well, to a person who doesn't even know they're there, we're going to be grounded in God, you know? It's like, why do I care? You know?
Yeah.
So Schaeffer would scratch them until he brought the despair to the surface first.
It's sort of a phrase we'll talk about in a couple of days, is that phrase of taking the roof off, right? And that's going to, what he's saying is he's lifting the roof on what this person thinks and how they live, and that's going to be different for every individual. And so in some cases you have to actually demonstrate to them and show them that they actually are in despair, and that would be part of it. So the line of uncertainty and despair, we'll talk about over the next week. We're going to talk about how certainty can be rooted in God and the fact that he is there and he is not silent, in Schaeffer's words. And ultimately, we're going to come back and affirm that that's the only place that we have certainty, the only place where certainty can be found. What we see in history, though, is cycles, and some of them overlap, but we're going to look at a couple of huge ones in history, one briefly and one in more detail, where culture will be very certain about their ability to know things. But if that is not rooted in the God who has revealed himself, then that certainty begins to break down. And society and culture begins to realize, it begins to have doubt and poke holes in their ideas of knowledge. And they're successful in doing that, which leads them to despair. Of course, no one wants to stay there, right? And so there tends to be a struggle to get out of that despair. And in no time during this process is there a return to the source of truth, God, then oftentimes culture hits a point where it's just a combination of skepticism and a focus on ethics. Think about our culture now. A combination of skepticism and a focus on social justice.
Which is weird because we have no basis for that social justice.
Exactly. Yeah. So Ramsey draws this line, this curvy line of uncertainty and despair. Yeah.
I just have one very good comment for James. There is a standard for social justice, and that's the only infallible standard, your feelings.
Okay. We'll come back to that later.
When you're at skepticism and ethics, then do you get back to certainty somehow? I mean, is it just because somebody comes up with a new idea, or are you certain of your ethics? How do you get back to the beginning and do this over and over again, which we do?
Yeah. I think there's a certain unstableness of society at that point, which tends to where change tends to come in and lead it down another path. I think it's typically.
Basically, the way I see it, you get to skepticism and ethics, and then your society collapses, and all the guys who built it die.
Oh.
So all your new guys are like, we need certainty because that knows it work.
Okay.
So we're going to spend most of our time this afternoon talking about Western culture from sort of the early points of the Enlightenment. But just to demonstrate that there is a cycle that occurs, I want to go through the Greek philosophy there first. If we go back far enough and look at the writings, we see Thales and Parmenides. And these guys had a type of certainty. Thales said everything is water. In fact, they were debating with each other about what was the ultimate basis for all things. And here he's saying it's water. Somebody else said it was fire. Somebody else said it was earth. Somebody else said it was air. And so there's all these theories being presented.
Said all four.
Some combination of the four. All these theories about what is the absolute, but they're at that point not really questioning that there is an absolute, that there is certainty. And then Parmenides has this famous statement. He says that whatever is. Okay, you hear the certainty ringing in that. Where Heraclitus, and actually we actually don't know who came first, Parmenides or Heraclitus. I think most people think Parmenides did, but we have both of their writings. Heraclitus says, well, whatever is changing. Okay. And we talked last week, I think, about that phrase of you can't step into the same river twice. That the river is always moving, and whenever the river is, but in a sense, it never really is one thing. It's always a little bit different. It's always changing. So there's the doubt coming in, and then Protagoras hit on relativity in relation to sense experience. He's saying that we might all be sitting in the same room, and some of us might be hot and want to turn that air conditioner up a little bit back there. Some of us might be a little bit cold and want to turn that air conditioner down a little bit. So some of us are hot and some of us is cold. So there's no truth there, right? It's all relative. So here's the doubt creeping into the thought. We get to Gorgias, and he goes to extreme uncertainty. He says knowledge is impossible. If something did exist, it could not be known. If something could be known, it could not be communicated. So no hope with respect to knowledge. Cratylus took Gorgias's words to heart and closed his mouth and stopped talking. Okay. Most everyone was living in an inconsistency, right? Nothing can be communicated, but we're still talking. This one man took it to its logical conclusion and stopped talking.
Did he write?
I assume not.
No, I guess not.
Okay.
Wouldn't he question whether or not the words were true, considering he believed that nothing could be communicated?
Well, yeah. I mean, you're showing the inherent inconsistency in that, right?
Yeah.
We think we mean something when we say nothing can be known.
We don't.
But if we can know that nothing can be known, then something is knowable, right? So yeah, there is a hard inconsistency at the levels of despair and even doubt. Then the guys that most people know about, we have come out of there. They're wanting to dig out of this despair. There's a struggle. Socrates starts asking questions. He thinks, well, if we pose the right questions and we seek the right knowledge, perhaps we can get it. Truth can be discovered through dialogues. You know, for instance, he wrote about, Plato wrote down most of Socrates' dialogue, one of them being Meno's paradox. You know, how do you look for, how do you find out knowledge? If you know what you're looking for, inquiry is unnecessary. You know it. If you don't know what you're looking for, inquiry is impossible. You don't know where to look. Therefore, inquiry is either unnecessary or impossible. So he poses these questions and says, well, surely there's an answer, because we're walking around and we think we know things. And so surely there's an answer to this. One of the things he posited was the idea of recollection, that there's innate knowledge that we have. And knowing is a recollection of that knowledge. Some theologians even today still go down that path. Plato continued the struggle. He with the idea of forms. He says, well, yes, the things that we see in this world are kind of imperfect, and our knowledge of them might be imperfect, but they're all based in a perfect form that is beyond our senses. And he had the allegory of the cave. I mean, if you've heard the allegory of the cave, raise your hand. Okay, so these guys are sitting down in the cave. You can see my great drawings now. So there's a cave, and there are people sitting down or standing in the cave. There's quite a few of them, and they're looking at this wall, and there's a great light behind them that's shining behind them, and all they know are the images in that on the wall of that cave. Well, the forms are they can't see the forms. They're behind them. So they know them imperfectly. But if you could entice a person to come out, people might say he's a crazy man at first because he can't see very clearly. But the more his eyes adapted to it, he would be able to discern the true form. So Plato's trying to get at what is the absolute? We don't seem to have access to the absolute in the world that we are in. And then Aristotle differed. Aristotle was Plato's student. He differed on the idea that there were absolute forms back here, but there was a concept of the absolute that just didn't exist. So we differed in Plato in that way, but still seeking to know the truth. Of course, we know Aristotle with his rules of logic, law of identity. A thing is something, for instance, and if it is something, if we can attribute a description to it, it can't be that thing and its opposite at the same time. It can't be A and not A at the same time. The law of identity and the law of contradiction. Two ideas opposed to each other can't both be true. They could both be wrong, but they can't both be true. And ethics. He had a theory of ethics that we were all seeking happiness. Coming out of this struggle were the Stoics, who put an emphasis on rationality and oneness with the universe and limited emotions, and the Epicureans, which put an emphasis on personal happiness, pleasure, and emotion, and then the skeptics, who said, well, you can't know anything, and pursuit of the knowledge is futile, but we're going to make a stand against any dogmatism, any claim of truth. We're going to deny that, and we're going to affirm that there are multiple truths, that there's pluralism in a sense. So we've gotten to skeptics and ethics. How do we
very
live?
dogmatic about the fact that there are no dogmatic statements.
Sure. So then that's sort of the line of despair in Greek philosophy. Any questions on that? That was mostly for demonstration purposes to get to the real meat of the lecture in a minute. Okay. Well, line of uncertainty in modern philosophy, which I want to claim when we get to the end, we're sitting over there where the Stoics and the Epicureans and the skeptics were, just in different ways. Where did we start? What started the process? How did we get from Anselm, for instance, who said, I do not seek understanding in order to believe, but I believe in order that I might understand. How did we get from his thinking in the 12th century to where we are now? And I want to suggest that it starts with two guys, Francis Bacon and Rene Descartes. Y'all have heard of those guys, right? Who was Francis Bacon?
He was the one who invented the frying pan.
But you cook bacon in a frying pan? On like a big flat skillet. What do you call it?
All right, somebody tell me, what's Francis Bacon famous for?
I don't think he invented cakes, so that's enough. He's for saying I think they're frying, right?
No.
That's
No,
Descartes.
that's Descartes. Oh well, that's right.
All right, he's the father of modern science.
Oh,
Right.
empiricism.
We're talking about empiricism.
Yeah, I remember. He went with forms, right? And the idea of how the mind perceives information.
No, that's Plato.
No, but he made a bit different one, didn't he?
Uh,
Was that Locke?
so he says that all of our knowledge comes through senses, comes through sense perception, and in fact we can get all knowledge that way. It's interesting that Francis Bacon is a Christian, and he's going to be influenced by Christian ideas, but he ceases to look at God and revelation for the basis of his certainty and his ideas. And he says that we can be autonomous from God, and we can learn things, we can know things through sense perception and through hypothesis and testing. That scientific method that you learned in your science books some time ago is rooted in Francis Bacon. Not only do we get knowledge, not only is that knowledge certain, but there are no limits to the knowledge that we can get through sense perception. Francis Bacon. The other, so he's the empiricist.
So optimistic.
Okay. And then we have Rene Descartes, who is contrasted with empiricists. What's Descartes?
Rational.
He's a rationalist. So part of what happens historically is these people start arguing with each other, right? Or do we know through the senses, or do we know through reason? Descartes that says we know through reason. In fact, not only do we know through reason, we can know things through reason, certainly, we can have certain knowledge. Not only can we have certain knowledge, there are no limits to our knowledge through reason. See how much they're saying that are similar to one another. But one of them is relying on reason. One of them is relying on sense perception. So Rene Descartes, he says, oh, we've got to get down to the things that we know. How do we do that? Well, let's start throwing out everything from history or from authority that we think we know. What is the one idea that I can get down to that I can affirm with certainty? He thinks of one thing and another thing, he throws that out. What he finally ends up with is, he phrases it like this. It might be strange to doubt the Bible, but you cannot doubt the mind. And you want to know why? We talked about this last week, actually, I think. Everybody knows why you can't doubt the mind. But, I mean, we're saying it's a strange idea to say that this doesn't exist, right? That's strange, but it's possible. You cannot doubt the mind.
The thing that's doubted.
Yeah, because in the act of doubting, the mind is affirmed. I think, therefore, I think. Okay. What do y'all think about that?
Assuming.
It's autonomous, right? Autonomous from God. Yeah, he's, I think, therefore I am. Think about Heraclitus and Parmenides. We'll talk about that in a minute. What was the debate going on there? Being versus coming. Whatever is. Whatever is changing. I think. Does that have any permanence?
Not
or is it
really.
fleeting? Can we go from there to I am?
Yeah, and I was just thinking that's
And
the
he's
claim
assuming-
God makes.
If that's the claim God makes, and that's the contrast I want to make, is that ultimately the only one that can claim that is God, and all of our claims of being are rooted in God's being and God's revelation to us that we think exist.
What's interesting, he doesn't make that claim exactly. His claim is, I am, therefore I am. It's slightly different.
This is how he says it.
But God said.
Oh, God says, I am who I am.
Yeah, I
sure.
am. That's what I was thinking of.
Yeah. Well, yeah. This is God is the only one that can claim I am. And interestingly, he progresses and builds an ontological proof for God on this. He says that I've affirmed thinking and I've affirmed doubt. And because I have a concept of doubt, that implies a concept of perfection.
Mm-hmm.
And the concept of perfection is not rooted in anything that we can see in this world. Nothing in this world that we perceive as perfect. The only place where perfection can lie is God. That's his ontological argument. But I think at the end of the day, it is lacking, because this has to be rooted somewhere else other than in our mind.
So I had a kind of interesting thought, which is, if we go all the way back to Genesis, when man is right before man is created, and God says, "Let us make man in our image." A lot of people pretty directly interpret that as we possess like a rational mind and all of that. So in a sense, we possess God-like attributes, if you know what I mean by that. But I was thinking, in another sense, it could easily be interpreted that man evidences the existence of God in so many ways. And so when God says, "Let us make man in our image," it's not necessarily that we possess his attributes, but we are an image or reflection which proves his existence, kind of like a picture of a shoe. You can't wear it. You can't
Yeah.
smell it.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that Romans 1 is getting at when Romans 1 tells us that his divine attributes are evident in the things that he has made. One of the things that he has made is ourselves.
Right.
And when we look inwardly, I think we look outwardly, we can see that as well, but we can look inwardly and see it, I think, even more pronounced.
Right, because when I was reading through like the Always Ready and some of the other books like that, you see that a lot of the ways that they are proving the existence of God, such as morality, rationality, things like that, are things that you find in man. So we effectively prove the existence of God.
To give evidence for the existence of God. Good, very good. Well, I want to show this line, but along the way, I want to show an opposition to the line. And there's an early opposition to the line that's roughly contemporary, and that's Blaise Pascal. And Pascal comes out and he takes Descartes to task. And he says, from an autonomous reason point of view, well, he says we can have knowledge of a type, but we can't know anything certainly, not autonomously. And he starts talking about he writes an apologetic of a type. I wish he had gotten to that. He wrote the Pensées, which was his thoughts. Died a young man, and we wish that he had got around to assimilating those thoughts and writing them in a compiled, cohesive way. But we can discern his thoughts, and he did not hesitate to go and talk about evidences for God, how God is seen in creation. He did not hesitate to talk about history and how just the resurrection and the growth of the church, the fulfilled prophecies. He appealed to all of these things as evidences. And he said, and after going through all of these things, he said, no reasonable man can deny the truths, these truths. Only an unreasonable man can deny these truths. But are they certain? No. No, they're not certain. If you want certain knowledge, that's in relationship. In fact, he had this. He had an experience. So we did know very few people, if anybody, knew about until after his death. His experience was written down on a piece of paper and sewn into his coat and found upon his death. And I don't have it in front of me, but the core of it, he uses the images of fire, right? There is something really perceivable here in a strong way. Fire, not the God of the philosophers, not the arguments that we just talked about a minute ago, not the God of the philosophers, but the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Fire. We don't know exactly what that means, but we do know what he was getting at, and that is his certain knowledge of God came from his relationship to God, not from the arguments. And he also threw the thing he's most famous for, unfortunately, is his wager. And I think in the whole scheme of this apologetic, it's kind of like a throw-in. After he said all those other things that we just talked about and said them 2 or 3 times, and then he looks at the unreasonable man and he says, if you need anything else, yeah, I'll throw you another bone. And here it is. If let's say you live your life on the idea of God, and you risk everything for that idea, and you die, and there is no God, you haven't lost anything. You've actually gained a good life. If, on the other hand, if you live your life on the idea that there is no God, and you risk everything on that idea, and then you die, and there is a God, then you've risked everything and lost everything. So he throws out this last called the wager that's intended to convince even the skeptic that he ought to reconsider. But Pascal is pushing against the main thread here, and I think in a very real way, being a prophet to where this whole project is going. Where does it go? Goes to David Hume is the skeptic of Western civilization. Who can tell me about David Hume?
If they're not perceiving it, it probably isn't there.
What's the big thing that he brought into question? Cause and effect. He brought cause and effect, and he did that by saying that all we have is associations. All we know is that when James punches me in the face, I tend to fall down. We don't know that the act of James punching me in the face causes me to fall down. We only know that they are associated. By the way, James has never punched me in the face. He would never do such a thing.
Innocent, guys. Innocent.
Just because James hasn't done it in the past doesn't mean it will remain this way in the future.
Yeah, and that's an argument that Hume is famous for as well, actually. So
I just made a good joke, you guys.
actually, you absolutely did. So Hume uses the picture of a billiard table, and he says what happens at the billiard table is there's a guy with a stick, right? And he takes his stick and he hits the ball, and that ball begins to move, and it strikes another ball and causes it to go into a certain direction, and then that ball eventually falls into a pocket, and we observe this. Yes.
I'm either thinking that my brother and brother-in-laws had to have been like reading you, but I think this is all like their original thought. They were thinking they're playing a pool game, talking about this very fact. Like, wait, just a second. How can we? All we see is correlation.
All you see is correlation.
And they were taught like it wasn't seem to be something they've been thinking on because they read Hume.
Sure.
I think they literally came to that exact same conclusion in that moment.
Well, good for them. And so yeah. So he says all we know is that one thing happens to the other. We don't know that one thing caused the other. Now I want to suggest that we do know certain things, that God has ordered the physical universe in a certain way, and there is a cause and effect, and all that stuff. And maybe Hume knew that as well. The famous line is, Hume saying that if you find a true skeptic, you better lock him up. So some people think that, well, Hume's has a purpose for what he's doing, but he's not a true skeptic. We don't know. But regardless, what he's shown is we cannot prove cause and effect. We can only prove correlation. This is a big problem, and so where do we go? The certainty of Bacon and Descartes is greatly under question here, and we hit despair. You want to know who Marquis de Sade is?
Yeah, sadist, right?
Yeah, that's where our term sadism comes from. So he's a proponent of really unthinkable actions. I'm not even going to talk about them here, right? Things that we would look at and we would say that is evil. Marquis de Sade did not say they were evil. And why did he say that they were not evil?
Because he wanted to do them.
Ultimately, I'm agree. But what reason do you think he might have given?
He didn't basically give a reverse Pascal's wager. He said that you can't really know if there's any reason to have any morality. You can't know what's going to happen, so you might as well do what you want while you have the life to do it.
Yeah, I don't know if he put it in that form. He may have.
He has a famous quote. It's way better.
Okay.
Yeah, I can't remember it right
now. But ultimately, what he's saying is that there's no right and wrong. You do whatever you want, right? So you can't know anything. If you can't know anything, there's no reason. it's standing in your path from doing whatever you desire, because then what you desire is what should be fulfilled, and you should seek fulfillment for that.
And then this quote is pretty much saying, like, if I'm right, then live life however you want. And if I'm wrong, I'd rather be in hell than in a heaven full of righteousness.
Yeah, ouch. Right. Can you imagine saying that? Yeah, can't imagine it. So Western civilization, I mean, obviously there's a lot of people walking around in Europe right now not having a clue about any of this conversation and still living on ideas of right and wrong and etc. But the philosophical world has been shattered by this. So we end up in struggle. And we see a little bit different line here because following Ramsey, I'm going to show two depths of despair and then struggle coming out of it, because the first one essentially fails. Immanuel Kant and Hegel. We may have talked briefly about both of these guys, I think. Maybe.
I know we've talked about Kant in some pretty good depth, but I'm not sure about Hegel.
All right, I'm going to cover them briefly again. We're going to talk more about Kant a little bit later as well. But Kant is very disturbed by Hume. In fact, he writes, he uses this phrase, he says, it's Hume that brought me out of my dogmatic slumbers. He's just slumbering along as a typical philosopher, and Hume startles him and brings him out of his slumbers. And Kant's project is to resurrect what?
Certainty.
Resurrect certainty. How do we know? And so, Kant's solution to the whole thing that we talked a little about previously is to posit these categories of the mind. That the mind has the ability to discern cause and effect, as it is things like quantity and quality and other acts of synthesis. He says the mind has innate functionality here that enables it to do that. So when it perceives the apple out there, it can perceive it correctly because it has the innate capability to do so. In fact, there is no true perception of the apple out there because there's no perception out there. Perception is in here. So the only perception of the apple is in the mind. And therefore, there's nothing to compare it to say that it's false. So if the mind says that it's cause and effect, it must be cause and effect. And so he says, yes, we can know the physical. But that's all we can know, because we cannot know the spiritual. So if you're talking about an apple, you can know an apple. But if you're talking about God, you cannot know God. So he's built this wall, this great wall between knowledge, between what he calls the phenomena or the physical and the noumena, or the mind, whatever might be an idea or anything that does not have substance. It's this wall of knowledge. Over here you can have certainty. Over here you have uncertainty. Have you heard that idea before? Yeah. This is another idea that our culture has embedded in it. That you can know, you can get knowledge from science. The scientists can give you knowledge. You can get knowledge from theologians, according to our culture. No, you can't. You can know the physical, you can't know the spiritual. So you might have some knowledge but it's your personal knowledge. It's relative to you. It might be good for you. It might work for you. And if it works for you, go and do it. That's fine with me. But I see something else, right? And so it's a relative. There's no absolute. There's no certainty. The certainty in the physical, uncertainty in the spiritual. And Kant says, some of you might be disappointed about all this, but remember where you were with Hume. I've actually saved knowledge for you. You should knight me and king me and saint me and all that because I've saved the day.
He only says that 3 times.
Okay, so that was Kant's solution. He's struggling to get out of the mess. Has he done it?
Hasn't he basically done the same thing that Plato and Aristotle and Socrates did?
In what way?
You construct this artificial system of knowledge by excluding the pneumo, but you can't actually validate that. You can't validate things like going to the laws of logic. Mm-hmm. Those aren't validatable from sense experience. You know what I mean? There's no reason to believe that those things are laws of law. They're universal.
Uh-huh.
He's just done the same thing that Aristotle and Plato did. You construct this artificial system that doesn't really fit with the way reality is. It lacks a moral compass, the ability to determine morals.
Mm.
He hasn't really saved knowledge. He's just saved a very small sliver of knowledge.
He's
not even really that.
I think he's ultimately thrown the whole question to another level.
What level is he throwing it to?
Well, he's in a sense he's almost said we can know by saying there isn't something to know. That's what it seems like to me. It seems very artificial in that way. And so in the end you end up going to the noumena anyway.
Yeah, well, he actually writes 2 big tomes. One is called The Critique of Pure Reason. And in its critique, that we just talked about his critique of pure reason. But then he follows that with another critique of practical reason. And in critique of practical reason, you may have heard, if any of you study any philosophy, the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative basically says that if there's a law, and if that law is going to be universal, then it must extend to everyone, or at least if it's a law concerning a class, it must extend to everyone in that class or everything in that class. It must be universalizable in order to be a true law, right? If you have a sign sitting on a perfect lawn that says do not walk on the grass, right? An individual might say, well, it's not going to hurt anything for me to walk on the grass, right? So I can walk on that grass. But if everybody walks on the grass, what happens? It ceases to be grass. So it says there is a universal law. There are absolutes, and Kant wanted to affirm those things, but he couldn't do it based on his theory of knowledge, because anything not physical could not be known. But he nonetheless wants to affirm that anyway. So he goes through, well, what if there are universals? Then what are the possible sources? And he goes through all the possible sources, and the answer is that only a personal God, only a moral absolutes can only come from a moral God. And so from a practical reason standpoint, you have to assume that there is a God and there are universal ethics. But we can't know it for certain. So there's some goodness there And there's also goodness in, I think he's hit on something. I believe that God made the world. He made us to be in the world. I believe that he made our minds in a way that we can perceive the world. Very similar to what Kant's saying here. The difference is I've said God about 3 times.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm giving you a basis for these things. That since God is the source of these things, that he has made us in a way that we can perceive his creation. And he's put us in it in order to take dominion over it. And to live in it. But Kant does not want to go to that metaphysical basis in his writings. So he's not quite getting us where we need to be. Let's talk about Hegel for a minute. Hegel comes from it from a different perspective. That for Hegel, only the rational is real. How does that contrast with Kant?
Well, Kant basically only the physical is real.
Yeah.
Hegel saying only the things in your mind, only the rational.
So you see this tug going on way back from Bacon and Descartes between the empirical and the rational and what gives us knowledge. It's still kind of going back and forth.
Kant never said that the noumena wasn't real. He just said you couldn't know.
Yeah, but it does have this element of our knowledge is rooted in the empirical method.
Yeah.
So God, for Hegel, God is in relationship with the world. And for Hegel, God is not being, but is rather not being, but becoming. So in relation to the world, truth is emerging. Perfection is emerging. We talked about the dialectic process, right? Where you have a thesis and an antithesis that are posited against one another. They're posited against one another. And what comes out of that is a synthesis, which becomes the new thesis, which then has a antithesis posited against not the same one that's here, a new antithesis, which then leads to a new synthesis. And so everything is progressing. So everything is progressing. Truth is emerging. God is emerging. Any absolute is emerging. Yeah.
Yeah, I misunderstood this for the longest time. I used to think what they were saying is either the thesis or the antithesis would win and become the synthesis. But that's not what they're saying.
That's right.
They're saying that they combine.
They combine.
The synthesis. And it's really a weird false view of knowledge.
The antithesis is necessary in order to produce the progress, which is the synthesis.
They're not saying that either one is bad or the one's going to lose. They're saying they combine together to create the synthesis.
So this is dialectic idealism.
What are they even claiming that does? Like, I don't even get what they're claiming.
Go further. Put some more words on it. They're claiming, well, how do we know? On this theory, do we know certainly?
No, because you're always going upwards towards more.
Yeah.
Yeah, the correct answer is not yet. Okay.
So will there ever be?
Good question. And how could there be?
No.
Thank you.
Yeah, but the idea, Hegel's going to claim that yes, there is an end point here. We'll get there someday, and then we will know. Okay. This is what's called dialectical idealism. Marxism, from Karl Marx, adopts this dialectic and makes it into dialectic materialism and denies God. It focuses now back on the material and advocates revolution right? You have a stable society, it's imperfect. You have a revolution against it, produce a new and better society that emerges out of that. And then he cast it in the context of class warfare as well as an economic system. So that's Hegel's solution. So has Hegel got us there?
He's struggling.
Yeah.
He doesn't really have certainty. He has potential certainty, but not certainty.
No.
And like, how do we even know that that will eventually get us there? We could just be going around in a perfect circle. And it's just such a large circle that our documentation isn't able to tell us that it's a circle.
Yeah, I think confidence or a presupposition is the only way you'll get your thought there in the end. And I think it has issues. I think anything can't, I think there's an issue with imperfection yielding perfection. And that's essentially what he's got in play there. He's assuming that at some point it will. And look at the parallels of that with, say, Hinduism. Reincarnation, the imperfect will get better and better and better and better and better. At some point it will reach perfection. Right. So the prophet, there's a second prophet here speaking against the trend, that if we listened to these prophets, we'd be better off, but we didn't listen to them. And this prophet is Soren Kierkegaard.
That's a really good name for a villain.
Soren Kierkegaard? Maybe the last name.
It has a good villainous name, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, Kierkegaard's most hated foil was Hegel. The world in Kierkegaard's day loved Hegel. Everybody, all the theologians, especially in Germany, all the theologians were just infatuated with Hegelian ideas, and Kierkegaard wrote against them, but was not widely read at that time. One of the things he said, well, Mr. Hegel, it doesn't do us any good today. The knowledge is way out there somewhere in the future. Doesn't do any, and because we're gonna live our days day to day, and a few decades from now we're gonna die, and we're gonna die without the truth. So what good? Even if you're right, which I don't think you are, but even if you're right that the truth is emerging out there somewhere, how can I know the truth? And I can't.
We live like there's truth.
We do.
Yes. Well, the problem with all these philosophies is no one actually lives consistently with them. You know what I mean?
Except that one dude who stopped talking.
Yeah. And Nietzsche. Nietzsche tried really hard.
And then
Really crazy.
I guess we could also include the guy who says if it works, then it works. In a sense.
Yeah, but even he's not being consistent because he's just ignoring the questions. Because the problem is either you ignore the philosophical questions or you ignore the realistic problems. All right? And you people do one or the other. You know what I mean?
It's just another way to not realize that you're in despair, is to say if it works.
So he's saying, how can we know? And it seemed like he knows anyway. So.
And so he argues against. He actually writes a whole book against Hegel. It's called Fear and Trembling, about Abraham. Because at the same time, Hegel's claiming that knowledge will emerge, and they're also constructing systems of ethics. And the theologian, the preacher who's infatuated with Hegel, is going into his pulpit on Sunday and preaching that Abraham's a man of faith. And Kierkegaard comes back and says, well, how can you explain Abraham's obedience on an ethical system? You're going to boil everything down to systems. How can you explain it? Abraham's basis for his faith is the authority of the spoken word of God. He follows in obedience purely on that, and not on any ethical system that you might construct. And he does that more powerfully than I've done just now. So he writes against Hegel. He also indirectly writes against Kant. There's another philosopher in play called Gotthold Lessing, which is written and said, my problem with knowledge of God is its knowledge of the infinite. And how can I have knowledge of the infinite through the finite? How can I know? I don't see God act. I don't see miracles before my eyes. I don't see resurrection before my eyes. All I have is witnesses, historical witnesses of resurrections and miracles. How can I ever know? If I'm going to know the infinite God, I need an infinite reason to know the infinite God. And how can that happen? And he's basically saying that that knowledge has to be certain. Lessing saying this, especially in relation to God, knowledge has to be absolutely certain. I call that the Lessing lapse, because I claim that we can know things and they not be certain. We might not be able to prove them, but we know them nonetheless. So I think it's the Lessing lapse. Kierkegaard goes with the Lessing lapse, but his point is that if you want certainty, it's not through objectivity, not through looking at the things, right, the physical. It's through subjectivity. What did Pascal know about knowing? What did Pascal say about knowing for certain? Yeah. Kierkegaard says that God is personal. He's made man personal. Man has a relationship with God. And there's actually a source of truth that Kierkegaard assumes that the scriptures, the written word, is true. He never makes an argument for them, but he assumes them to be true. But he also appeals to the Spirit, the God within us, revealing that truth. He says the truth is known for certain only this way. He's flipped the wall upside down. What can be known for certain? The spiritual. What cannot be certain? The physical.
It's really interesting.
He has flipped the wall upside down. You want another reason why I like Kierkegaard? That's it. Yeah, what'd you say?
So it's not true that he fell on the heap when he tried to make the leap.
It's not true that what?
That he fell on the heap when he tried to make the leap.
No, he didn't fall on a heap when he tried to make the leap. Yeah. So yeah, that's worth spending 2 minutes on. Lessing says it's this broad, ugly ditch. This broad, ugly ditch he cannot get across. Here's God over here, and here's Lessing over here. He's looking at what? He's looking at evidence. He's looking at the finite world. He's looking at all kinds of different things. It's broad. He makes a leap. He falls in the ditch. He crashes down. Nothing that he sees can give him the confidence of leaping over that to God. He's looking for something of quantity enough to get him there. Kierkegaard tells Lessing, it's not quantity, it's quality. It's relationship. But that's how you get over the ditch. Yeah.
It's really difficult though to apply this practically speaking, because like I get it.
Yeah.
And I know like for all the philosophy and all, what really comes down to it when, it's 2 a.m. and all hope seems lost is holding on to those experiences, that subjectivity of God that you've had. But at the same time, the Mormons are constantly using, that argument that, oh, I sat down and I read the Book of Mormon and I felt something.
Yeah.
And that's what they tell Mormons to do. And so, like, how do you deny that while affirming the
Yeah.
certainty that we grasp in almost the exact same thing?
Yeah, very good. And I'm gonna put some simple words to it now, and then say on Thursday, if not before, we're going to dig into that much deeper. Okay. And I think that part of it goes back to our study of Bonson and Clark, and the idea that the evidences provide confirmation of the presuppositions that we know, and the test of coherence that Clark relies on, and and the reliance on the written word. I'd say Kierkegaard never makes an argument for it. If you want an argument from Kierkegaard on the Bible versus the Book of Mormon, you're not going to find it, because his presupposition is the Bible.
Yeah.
Right. But I think he does make strong arguments within that circle, and then we can then look at was it Mormonism that you brought up? Yeah, Mormonism, and I think we could critique it from a Bonsian point of view, and like we talked about the last couple of weeks, in a way that Christianity would hold up in a different way. But we will get there more deeply by Thursday at least, if not before. All right. Okay, so truth is subjectivity, assumes scripture, revelation is truth. There's a personal relationship with the eternal God. Certainty emerges from that relationship. Well, the sad part is Kierkegaard is being read by very few people, all in Denmark, nowhere else. So that message is not heard, and so we end up back in despair with Nietzsche. Nietzsche takes Kant to his logical conclusion: if you can't know God, if you have no metaphysical basis for the system. The issue with Kant is he's put a system in place and he's claimed that this can do this and this can do that, but without God in the picture, without that metaphysical basis, his theory fails and leads back into despair. For Nietzsche, God is dead. There is no good and evil. He writes a famous book called Beyond Good and Evil. So after we've jettisoned the concepts of good and evil, what now? And I know I've given the warning before about reading Nietzsche. He's very hard to read, and he'll take proverbs and misstate them, and they sound like scripture, but they're actually turned upside down. So be very careful engaging Nietzsche. It's strong ideas. Ultimately, what determines right action if there's no good and evil? For Nietzsche, it's power, the will to power. He writes to his fellow Germans, time is wasting. Get out there and assert your will on everyone else. It's the right thing to do because you can do it. His sole reason is will to power. He writes about the Übermensch. Anybody know who the Übermensch is? Superman, yeah. The concept of an emerging power, evolved man that comes through the exertion of will to power. So when we see, there is a tie. I don't want to make the tie too strong, but Nazism is called Nazism for a reason. It's based on Nietzsche, and it's based on ideas, the lack of good and evil, the idea of the Übermensch emerging to focus on races and elimination of lesser races.
You know that in the Superman, the DC comics, I actually play this out. There's a philosophical meta-narrative in there.
Okay,
Yeah, I'll explain that to you over dinner.
very good. So Nietzsche leads us into the depths of despair. How do we get out? New struggle. Sartre, Camus, Heidegger. These are all existentialists. The ideas of absolute truth and absolute being are destroyed through Nietzsche and so forth. So where do we go? For Sartre, he says there's choices without objective norms. There's no good and evil that's going to determine what the right course of action is. It's only your personal choice. Perhaps you're responsible for that personal choice. I don't know. But there's no absolute. There's no universal. There's no law that's going to guide you. Camus. We're going to talk about Camus more later this week. Camus says that the human should be the only one way to live, and that's through rebellion. We talked about briefly that statement that he made. There's really only one serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. And we think he's talking about physical death. But actually, when you're reading, he's actually talking about a philosophical suicide and the idea of God. He criticizes Kierkegaard. He criticizes other writers that appeal to the absolute, that appeal to God. He says that no, to go that route is philosophical suicide, rational suicide. There's nothing there. There is no hope. The human spirit wants hope. We want hope. We want all these. We want the idea of goodness. We want eternal life. We want there to be something more than the material, but there is none. Therefore, the only thing that we can do is to rebel against it. We live as though there might be hope, even when there is no hope, because we're rebelling against the absence of hope. That's Camus' answer. And it's an answer that's lacking, because ultimately he has no reason for assuming the position of the rebel. Where are we now? We're with
Heidegger.
Heidegger approaches it another way. He says that there's no truth. There's no truth with a big T. There's only perspectives of truth. And in fact, truth changes in every circumstance. He looks at the human. He says that humanness is, in a sense, being thrown into existence. We're just thrown into a particular circumstance, and that circumstance defines us.
Which is what Pleasantville was about.
Yeah, it is. And so we have no being. We have no essential being. We're defined by our environment, the people around us, the perceptions around us. If we were in a different environment and with different relationships, there would be a completely different truth. So there is nothing to hold on to for Heidegger. So the struggle here. Now I want to talk about the last prophet, which we talked about him a little bit in the beginning, and we're going to talk about him more this week. Michael Polanyi. Polanyi was a physical chemist, and he won a Nobel Prize in physical chemistry. He was the top of his field. Unfortunately, at the moment, I don't remember whether he was at Oxford or he was at Cambridge. He was at one of the two. We'll pretend it's Oxford, and maybe otherwise. So he went to the powers to be at Oxford, and he said, I've decided I can't do anything more in physical chemistry. I need to move to philosophy. Okay. And so he resigned his chair in chemistry, and they granted him, with no formal training, a chair in philosophy. And he continued there. His starting point was an observation. Science doesn't work the way that science claims to work. Science claims that there's data out there. And the Bacon and the empirical method claims that all we have to do is observe the things that are out there, and that will lead to truth. And he says that demonstrable is the fact that we don't operate science that way. We don't do it that way. And in fact, we'll talk about Pascal a little bit more later. Pascal did a lot of wonderful things, but one of the stupid things that he did was he was doing experiments on barometric pressure. And he had all the key data that he needed for his conclusions, but then he spent time and time and time afterwards testing all the various combinations that he could possibly think of to test to complete his data, when nobody does science that way now. How do you do science?
You come up with a theorem, and you test it, like we have this evidence, and then you leave that, and then someone else comes and tests it and tries different ways. Right?
Well, you have a hypothesis, right? Your idea is not rooted in the data that's out there.
No.
Yeah, your experiments
are
only designed to validate or to invalidate the idea, right?
And other people go on to try and invalidate your idea.
You may do it, or other people may do it. Yeah, and it's a progressive thing.
But your experiment's usually designed to validate your ideas.
Yeah.
Because he did the other. He tried to find all the combinations to invalidate, which is really impossible.
Sure.
When you get down to it.
Right. And so Klein observes that this method that we've been claiming is not what we actually do. And in fact, there's a lot in our minds that goes into figuring out the truth that we're going to go out and construct experiments to either prove or to disprove. And
that's his book?
Yeah. Well, that's part of his book. Yeah.
Oh, it's just part?
Yeah.
Can I read it?
Yeah. So he recognized that we have a framework in our mind. We have a lens. A lot of people talk about lenses that we look for. Is our mind there's an innate portion of mind that's inherently capable of discerning things about the world. But we also accumulate knowledge. We accumulate a view of the world. And as we accumulate a view of the world, increasingly we're able to see more things through that view that we have. So the mind and rationality are always in play. And then interestingly, he says something, he never pursues it any further, but he says it at multiple places, something like scientific knowledge is not much different than theological knowledge. They both work essentially the same way. We know the physical and we know the spiritual in essentially the same way. As our mind posits a truth, and then we might use a scientific method to validate or invalidate. We might use reason to validate or invalidate. We have various methods of proving or disproving the idea. But the idea, the truth, is an intuition that comes from our existing knowledge.
Now, is he a Christian?
No.
Don't you hate that?
Yeah. And that's why I mentioned Thompson and Newbegin, because then Thompson and Newbegin engage his thought from a Christian point of view. But he said he didn't say Christians. He said theologians, stand up, take notice of what I'm writing, because there's fruit to be gained here. So he sort of left that open.
I wonder how people get close like that and just like, meh. You know what I mean?
Well, he was rooted as a scientist, and unfortunately, he wasn't concerned too much about the Christian worldview. He was concerned with knowledge in general.
Okay.
So that's what he focused on. Okay, so Polanyi is getting increasing play. I wouldn't be surprised if he's a more prominent figure generation from now than he is now, or even 10 years from now than he is now. It's getting increasingly. We heard about him on a Mars Hill tape, for instance, that I was talking about earlier. Francis Schaeffer, and in one of his books, it may be the one that we're reading, I think it is, He Is There and He Is Not Silent, calls Polanyi perhaps the most intelligent person known to Schaeffer at that time. He valued the work that highly. So what's Polanyi doing? He's going back to this assumption that was made by Bacon and Descartes in the middle, in the beginning, and questioning their starting point. Ultimately, where does it lead? Where do we sit today? We sit in liberal theology. Liberal theology denies the authority of Scripture. It focuses on ethics. It focuses on social justice. I heard this quote recently from circles of liberal theology. We believe in social justice with a healthy dose of Jesus thrown in. Mm-hmm. Okay, got it upside down, doesn't it? Rightly focused on ethics,
but wrongly focused on.
But if not recognizing the basis for it, just appealing to some concept of Jesus alone.
Jesus was really concerned with social justice in his time.
Yeah, and social justice might not have the same definition we put on it now, but he was concerned about the poor for sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Liberation theology. Anybody know what liberation theology is?
Oh, yeah, I've heard the word, but I can't remember.
It's sort of recasting salvation and redemption to things like liberating oppressed people groups, like
the Samaritans,
like the generations from the slaves, mm-hmm. American black population, salvation for them. Feminism mm-hmm. is a liberation theology. It's recasting the whole gospel message in terms of liberating oppressed people group, basically.
What is it now for the gay movement? The LGBTQ XYZ.
Yeah. So that's another liberation theology movement now. Mm-hmm. So like we saw before, a focus on ethics, right? Mm-hmm. And then also skepticism. Postmodernism is sometimes a difficult thing to get your hand around. But one of the things it says there is no absolute truth. You can't. It doesn't exist. All truth is relative. So a move toward a pluralistic society that we can't affirm anything to be true, so we have to accept all ideas and accept all equally. And in all practical matters, we're going to be secular. We're just going to consider science. We're just going to consider ethics as we might, social justice, etc., as we might define it. But don't appeal to God. Caitlin told us last week about her college studies where it was actually forbidden for her and her papers to appeal to God.
Really?
Yeah. She could not. It was against the rules to do it at a community college in North Carolina.
You wouldn't. I mean, Northeast is hostile, and you wouldn't even get that.
Right. Yeah. Well, we exist in a more conservative. Yeah. Whereas the Raleigh-Durham area is there's been a lot of immigration and migration from other parts of the country into that area. There's a vortex that connects Chapel Hill and San Francisco. I'm convinced of it. Okay.
Why do you think the church has moved to liberal theology and liberation theology? Like, what's the motivation behind that?
Ease, comfort, lack of hardship.
Well, it's skepticism. It's back to I want to say it's uncertainty and despair, right? What have they rejected from the Bible?
The total authority of Scripture.
Authority of Scripture, but I think there's a motivation to reject that.
Aiming behind
Sufficiency.
God because it is an easy truth. So, in escaping this difficult truth, they find despair and an utter vacuum of truth.
Okay.
That was deep, man.
It was good. Did you write that down? I want to come back to it.
Like 3 pages ago.
Okay. All right. Is there any confidence in miracles?
No.
Liberal theology have any confidence in miracles?
No.
Have any confidence in the resurrection
So materialism then. It's
or
kind of,
creation?
Yeah.
Any of these things, what's missing here is the spiritual.
Yeah.
Right. It's content. At the end of the day, it's an acceptance of physical knowledge and a rejection of spiritual knowledge. Okay, I want to give a quote from C.S. Lewis here. He says, "We all want progress, but progress means getting nearer to the place where you want to be. And if you have taken a wrong turning, then going forward does not get you any nearer. If you're on the wrong road, progress means doing an about turn and walking back to the right road. And in that case, the man who turns back soonest is the most progressive man. There is nothing progressive about being pig-headed and refusing to admit a mistake. And I think if you look at the present state of the world, it's pretty plain that humanity has been making some big mistakes. We're on the wrong road. And if that is so, we must go back. Going back is the quickest way on. So if we go back, where do we go?
Back to Lonnie, Aristotle, Pascal, back to certainty.
Back to certainty, which takes us even back before Bacon and Descartes, because what was the root mistake that Bacon and Descartes made?
They started relying on their senses. They started relying on their faculties to determine these things.
Senses for Bacon, reason for Descartes.
Yeah.
But in both cases, the individual was autonomous in knowing, and no longer expressing a dependence on God who has spoken. And that's why we're reading this week, Shaker's book, He is There and He is Not Silent. I think that he makes that point in that book as well as anyone else has made, I think. Is that ultimately our confidence in knowledge is rooted in the fact that God is not only there, but He has spoken. And that's where we tie our confidence back to. All right, we've run a little bit long here, but are there any questions?
A bit long. I felt like I've been here for 10 minutes.
Good, very good.
I thought it was long.
James.
Banished to the corner for the rest of the day. All right.
There must be something.
All right, well, let's take a
magic
break.
about it.
We got about 20 minutes before supper time, and then we'll come back at 7. Yeah, but wait, I need to keep them for a couple of days.
Well, can I just read a little bit of it during the 20 minutes?
Yeah.
So cool. So are these both by Klein?
Yes.
The last name of that.
Technology, American Society of Exploring.